This is Embodied from PRX and WUNC. I'm Anita Rao. Long before he was a professional ornithologist, Drew Lanham's life was defined by birds, like the many he grew up with in rural South Carolina.
I could always just count on those birds. I could depend on them to be in these places that were ragged around the edges, but the birds found comfort there, and I found comfort in the birds being there.
Drew's ability to lock in and deeply observe nature led him to a dual career as a scientist and artist, who centers his love for birds in both professions.
If we're going to use the science to save birds or to save us, then we're not just going to have to think about it, we're going to have to feel.
What birds can teach us about wildness, joy, and belonging, just ahead on Embodied. For J. Drew Lanham, life has always been about the birds.
It was easier for me to learn bird calls and to speak to birds, and to have them answer on occasion gave me a kind of comfort that I did not have with people.
Drew grew up on 200 acres of land in rural South Carolina, which had been in his family for generations. His day-to-day life wandering those woods as a kid was defined by wildness.
I try to tell folks that growing up in a place where there were more white-tailed deer and wild turkeys was my life situation. That's what rural is to me. It's being able to go outside your back door and hear foxes bark or turkeys gobble, or flushing a covey of bobwhite quail up from a roadside ditch.
As Drew got older, his passion for birds was challenged by outside expectations and responsibilities, and the realities of being a Black man in the rural South. But throughout it all, he's held on to the belief that birds are an essential portal to joy that we must not overlook. This is Embodied, our show about sex, relationships, and health. I'm Anita Rao. Ever since the pandemic, it seems like everyone I know is talking about bird watching. Whether they're downloading identification apps or joining birding groups, more people than ever are interested in birds. I have been reticent to join in on the hype for some personal reasons, but we'll get to that story later. Drew has been tracking this boom in bird watching as both an ornithologist and a poet. And his take is that the hobby doesn't require a bunch of gear or expensive trips. You can just slow down and look around wherever you already are. That's what he did as a kid. Drew was born in 1965 and was raised in between the two houses on his family's property, his grandmother Mamatha's house and his parents' house. He spent a lot of time walking between the two, observing nature.
Those walks daily, once I was old enough to make what as a kid seemed like miles, but in reality is about a quarter of a mile walk between my grandmother's house where I slept and my parents' house, mostly by the dirt road. But that time added up. Those walks, those wanderings, cumulatively speaking, became really my love affair, my first love affair with nature.
So what is the first bird that you remember really falling in love with? Is there one that really called to you?
The bird that called to me, literally, were bobwhite quail.
Uh-huh.
That birds my grandmother called partridges. That call of was what greeted me when I came out of her house. And hearing that call, especially in the spring and the summer and the fall, was a reassurance, because I kind of knew where the flocks of those birds, and for quail we call those flocks coveys, I knew where they hung out. And so on that wandering from the ramshackle to the ranch, I knew on the first curve where my bicycle often got mired up in the sand, there was a little ditch there that led up to a hill that was always sort of brambly, and you could almost always count on a half dozen or more of those bobwhite quail flushing from that thicket and then scattering to the four winds, kind of, and then there would be this recovery.
Flushing is just like this explosion of feathers. Is that what that is?
Yeah, exactly. It's an explosion of feathers. It's your first reaction, and I would imagine a predator's first reaction on encountering a covey of quail is that you can know where they are, but ultimately they will surprise you.
Hmm.
And so that was, I think, the first bird that I fell in love with because it was as familiar as any friend to me, and I could count on them. I could always just count on those birds. I could depend on them to be in these places that seemed unkempt, were ragged around the edges, but the birds found comfort there, and I found comfort in the birds being there.
So you didn't have your own binoculars as a kid, but you had lots of creative ways to try to see birds up close. And I know that sometimes you even played dead to like literally lure them close to you. Tell me about that. What were you doing?
Well, no, I didn't have binoculars. I dreamed of having binoculars, and lots of kids will use their hands like binoculars, and that actually helps you to focus in on a bird. But then I wanted to be closer, and knowing who the vultures, as my grandmother and most of my family called them at the time, who the buzzards were and what they wanted. I decided one day, after taking the trash out to the gully as my grandmother would have me do, there were vultures, there were buzzards, as she called them again, circling. And so I just took it upon myself to see if I could draw them in closer. Now, these were turkey vultures, as I remember. So I didn't know at the time that those birds depended largely on smell to find carrion, to find dead things. But I laid out in the pasture on one of the trails as dead as I could be as a living little boy. I guess I was little boy stinky, but not vulture stinky, because the birds circled, right? And it seemed to me that they were drawing closer and closer so that I could see their heads turning to look at me, I guessed. But then after they got so close, I remembered my grandmother's warnings about vultures, about buzzards picking the eyes out of their prey. So I remembered that, and I liked my eyes. I wanted to continue to watch birds, and so I got up and ran away because it seemed to me the vultures were getting a little close, and I didn't really want to be dead. So
I love that. I mean, yeah, you had a lot of different tricks. You also tried to fly at times, jumping off of your house. You had a lot of tricks up your sleeve to try to get closer to birds.
it was, again, it was constant. I spent so much time outside watching birds and wondering how they flew.
Hmm.
I didn't know any of the science. I didn't have any clue about lift and thrust and the airfoil of a feather. And I just knew that on Saturday mornings, I could watch Wile E. Coyote fly to some degree. And so I figured that Professor Wile E. Coyote was trying to tell me something. And so I would go outside, and anything that was high enough, I would jump off of it in an attempt to, I don't know, catch some wind under cardboard wings or parachute from trees with plastic bags. I tried the Mary Poppins method and immediately inverted several umbrellas, which got me into a little bit of trouble. But that act of flight proved impossible for me, a husky sized boy who loved jelly cake and grits. But it nonetheless inspired me to think about flight as a way to gain access to faraway places, that it was the ultimate freedom that birds expressed.
So you had these lessons firsthand from your experiences on these walks, your experiences trying to fly, your experiences getting up close to birds, but then you also had your grandmother's voice in your ear. And you've mentioned these different names your grandmother had for birds, buzzards for vultures and partridges. And she was in many ways the first person to teach you about birds, but you've described her as a teacher of mystic ornithology. Tell me about that mysticism and how that shaped your early love of those creatures.
Well, she was a very religious person who had me read to her from the Bible every night. And she was the chief of the usher board at her church. But then you contrast that with these nightly visits from ghosts and dead folks. And so I lived in between these worlds of a fundamentalism and kind of this fantastical world of mysticism. And so the birds that she recognized by different names, as you said, rain crows for yellow-billed cuckoos, yellowhammers for northern flickers, big owls for barred owls, cat owls for great horned owls, snowbirds for juncos. All of those became my ornithology. And yes, she was really the first person to present this affection for birds because she would throw out handfuls of grits, raw grits from the bag because there were all these brown birds and then the gray and white juncos out scratching around on the ground. And it was her sympathy for birds, her saying that she pitied these birds because they were out in the cold trying to scratch out a living. My grandmother's personal ornithology is still with me. It directs me in how I think about nature and how I think about birds as these beings that are worthy, deserving of our care and consideration in how we live our lives.
Just ahead, we'll talk with Drew about how he almost ended up as an engineer and the specific bird call that pulled him back to ornithology. You're listening to Embodied from WUNC, a broadcast service of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. You can also hear Embodied as a podcast. Follow and subscribe on your platform of choice. We'll be right back.
It's easy to know you want to make a change in your life, but it is hard to actually do it. How to Be a Better Human from TED is a podcast for when self-help feels too daunting or just not for you. I'm Chris Duffy, the host of How to Be a Better Human, and trust me, I do not have it all figured out. But join me as I talk to experts about actually attainable ways we can try to improve our lives. Whether it's facing fears, setting boundaries, cleaning your house, or all sorts of other topics. Find How to Be a Better Human wherever you get your podcasts.
This is Embodied. I'm Anita Rao. Today we're talking with poet and ornithologist Drew Lanham about his lifetime of loving birds and what it's taught him about both nature and people. Drew's passion for winged creatures started when he was a kid and was solidified by his experiences growing up on 200 acres of land in rural South Carolina. But when he got to high school and expressed interest in studying birds in college, counselors told him there was no way to make that into a living. He was good at math and science, so they pushed him in the direction of engineering.
There was no normal Black person, especially that studied birds, at least according to guidance counselors and those around me, both adult friends and teenage friends. And so as a couple of pretty healthy scholarships dropped and I had the opportunity to send myself to school, I succumbed to peer pressure in a way and said, okay, maybe you're right. I'll take the money. I'll do this engineering thing. But that was quite a few years of suffering and being passionless.
So then what changed your mind? Like what happened that when you were a junior that made you switch gears?
Well, honestly, what I now understand was depression, just this listlessness that had me considering all kinds of things, and that if I wasn't going to be able to live my life according to the edicts of birds coming and going and knowing this song and that song, that maybe I needed to do something else, like be in the military and maybe fly. It was, of course, at that point in time, the age of Top Gun and Tom Cruise. And so I thought, well, maybe I'll do that. I'll fly away, literally. And at times I just thought about not existing. And so, a dream deferred, as they say, is can be a nightmarish thing. And so living in that state became overwhelming
Yeah.
in a way. And so I stopped going to class. I didn't really care about grades. I started looking for alternatives in my life because I had spent so much time jumping through the proper hoops and the expected hoops for everyone else that I had not taken the time to understand that I had my own dreams.
Hmm.
And so I remember coming back to the old home place that after my father died, my mother moved. And I've sort of realized this recently, but once I left home for college, I never went home again to the home that I had known. And so when I took my first trip back there after the property had been logged and abused, and I was still in engineering and I was there on spring break, I remember looking out across this landscape that I had always known as wooded, and it had been stripped of trees, and there were just a few scraggly saplings standing. And I heard the song of a prairie warbler, just this climb up the chromatic scale, this zee, 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 zee. And I didn't have binoculars,
Mm-hmm.
but I could see this bird lift its head, open its beak, and let this song pour out. And in that moment, that bird helped me make a decision. It helped me solidify. It brought me back to the initial love. And I knew that when I went back to school after spring break, things had to change.
So you really had this huge turning point from which you began a new path. You turned what had long been a deep passion and a deep love into a professional pursuit. You went on to get a master's degree in zoology, that you then got a PhD in forest resources. And I'm so curious about what it was like to turn what had been a hobby and something that was just for you into something that now you had to calculate and measure and think about as a scientist. What was that transition like?
It was freedom.
Uh-huh.
It was like all the jumping off of higher things that I had done and fallen, that something caught me and lifted me up. And it was the winds of wonder, I think, that were reinvigorated, that I was able to catch and fly. And so when I left engineering, I was in the second semester of my junior year. Going from engineering to zoology should have probably cost me an extra, I don't know, 2.5 years. But I had an advisor, Dr. Jim Schindler, who was just amazing at understanding my passion. He wasn't a bird guy. My new advisor wasn't a bird guy. He was a limnologist, a lake specialist. But he saw in me the passion for ornithology, for becoming a naturalist. And he really helped to open this door through which I didn't walk through it, I flew through it.
Hmm.
And he knew that I needed to fly through it. And so he made that possible. And there was very little that I didn't like in my new major. And so the listlessness disappeared and was replaced by this energy and this tailwind that has brought me to really to this point.
As you continued to advance in your studies, doing a master's degree and then a PhD, were you able to hold on to that mystery and that deep sense of love of birds, even as you were really learning how to study them as a scientist?
Yeah, that's a great question. And part of what I'm understanding in my life now as a scientist and artist is sort of that tension that develops between the analytical left brain and the creative right brain. And I didn't feel that initially. Where some of that began to emerge between that left and that right brain was a bit further down the line as I saw students that I was teaching sort of really begin to question why they were even there. All the news that we can ever have about the environment that we were giving about extinction rates and habitat fragmentation, and people were beginning to have these conversations about climate change, seemed to do nothing but elicit looks of despair
Hmm.
from the students. And so how do we take a love of something and turn it into despair? Well, I think part of what we do as scientists is that we deliver the data. We deliver that news, that erstwhile truth, at least, of a phenomenon as we have measured it and the statistics tell us. But then how do we move forward and do anything with this sort of paralysis of overanalysis, really, sometimes, and that, as Rachel Carson said, is sometimes more important to feel than to think. And so if we were going to use the science, if we're going to use the science to save birds or to save us, then we're not just going to have to think about it, we're going to have to feel. Just as I had developed these feelings for bobwhite quail, and I knew that I could depend upon them, and I had my own sort of ornithology born of my grandmother's. That was a turning point for me, reading things like a Sand County Almanac from Aldo Leopold, or reading Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, and reading the poetry of Walt Whitman, or understanding who Henry David Thoreau was. All of that contributed to me becoming, I think, maybe a different kind of scientist who wasn't afraid of the tension between that right creative side and that left analytical side.
What were some of the bigger scientific questions that have driven your career that allow you to combine both of these parts of yourself?
Well, the some of the bigger questions, I think, initially were about how we carve up habitat and how birds respond to that. And so I studied that for a while in terrestrial systems, and still relate to that. But then a good bit of my work with endangered species began to interface with really the creature that demands the strictest management, which is Homo sapiens. It's us.
Hmm.
And understanding that many of these birds and other wild things, that sometimes given a minimum of a chance, found a way, but we weren't and haven't been giving them even a minimal chance to survive, and certainly not to thrive. And so that question of resilience, that question of persistence, of how we survive under stress, became important to me, especially as a Black man who lives a bit of that life on the daily. And so I began to see these larger questions of range of how my life, both spatially and temporally, collides with the lives of wild things and the things that they experience. And so the stressors that a Black bird might feel of being persecuted because it's a Black bird and it gathers in large flocks, and maybe it's social, or maybe too loud for some people, or maybe they don't see any redemption in it not being a colorful bird, and so it's persecuted. It's not thought of in the same way that a more colorful bird like a painted bunting might be. And so my questions of existence as a Black man in America began to converge with the questions of persistence for not just Black birds, but all birds in America and beyond, because it really became an essential question once again, Anita, of how we feel about a thing or how we feel about someone. And that's where the personal ornithology, I think all the years of establishing my range as a Black man, from a kid loving birds to someone pushed away from it to someone returning to it and now living that life, have given me a chance to think about my range map, to think about where I thrive versus where I just survive.
In hearing you talk about this, you so easily blend like the philosophical musings about humans and birds with the scientific questions that you have with your feelings about all of it. And I know my partner is a scientist, and we talk a lot about how, in academic writing, you're not allowed to really express feelings, and there is not an encouragement for scientists to talk about their feelings openly. So I'm curious about what it's been like for you to navigate this as someone who is a tenured professor. You are in these academic spaces. Like, have you had any hesitations about crossing and blurring these lines?
Um, I haven't had hesitations about doing it. I think at times it's given hesitation to peers and chairs and deans and others who
Uh-huh.
who is this guy? What is he doing? Um, and so I've been full speed ahead with it, in part because my heart has told me that I'm in the right place. It feels right to do what I do. And so it's hard to be hesitant when passion is pushing at you.
Hmm. Yeah.
You can be at that ledge and initially afraid to fly, not knowing whether your wings are cardboard or feathers, or whether you're going to be held up by something. If there's passion there to push you, you know that it's going to catch you. And so in the hard days, even now, in thinking about the work that needs to be done for bird conservation, the work that needs to be done for social justice, the work that needs to be done for our environment, it's a pretty simple motivation. It's what I love. And so there's no hesitation in that.
Throughout all of this writing and research, you've also kept bird watching as a hobby. And I'm curious to know what it's been like to navigate the predominantly white hobbyist spaces as a Black man and how that's changed for you over the years.
Well, it's at times it's been like, I don't know, being a crow in a flock of snow geese.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have a good bit in common. You can both fly, you both recognize the environment in a way that feathered flighted things do. But if you're a crow or raven in the midst of mostly white snow geese, there are a few blue-faced snow geese out there, but here I am Here we are, the few of us who practice this as professionals, still at meetings and maybe given sidelong looks as some people wonder what we're doing there. It has gotten better on several fronts, of course, with Black Birders Week and young birders coming through who sort of have a different way of attacking the issue. Those of us who would call ourselves the old heads would say, yeah, we've been loving these birds for a while, even when people saw our differences and wanted to punish or isolate us because of that. But I always like to go back, Anita, to this whole idea of the ancestors also noticing birds. They had to. The story goes that not infrequently the enslaved who were being brought over in the Middle Passage would approach the coast of South Carolina and see the sea islands and the birds of those sea islands, the gulls and the waders, and think that they had returned home. And so as we watch birds today through binoculars and high-tech equipment, I think we've always looked skyward, no matter the color of our skin. And so I'd like to think of my ancestors as having, in many ways, led me to this place. And that idea of Sankofa, that bird reaching back to bring forward the past, is where I am. And so if there's a bird for me to wave on that flag, it's that idealized Sankofa, to recognize those before me that have done what I'm doing, but in a different way, and in all likelihood, more bravery than I have had to exhibit, as their humanity was constantly called into question, but they still look skyward to see some birds flying free, knowing that that was what they were aspiring to. And so being able to write that, being able to communicate that as a poet and a creative writer means everything to me. That I'm able to take words, sometimes the data that's been gathered, that we've gathered as scientists, and to aim it more at heart than head. That's my job now. It's my job to have people feel as well as think. And if we can bring those two powers together, then not just birds, but we all stand a chance at some hope.
Just ahead, I make a confession to Drew about my complicated relationship with birds and ask him for some advice. As always, you can hear the podcast version of this show by following Embodied on your platform of choice. We'll be right back. This is Embodied. I'm Anita Rao. We're talking today about falling in love with birds and how one man has maintained this passion for decades, despite the obstacles and challenges along the way. That man is ornithologist, author, and poet Drew Lanham. He's written a memoir and 2 poetry collections that reflect on his upbringing close to the land in rural South Carolina and his experiences as a Black man who loves nature. Drew thinks deeply about wildness and the natural world, and I was really moved by his writing. But after talking with him for a while about his many experiences with birds, I had to share that my feelings about the creatures are different. So I've been spending a lot of time with your poetry and with your memoir over the past few weeks and embedding myself in these stories of how you fell in love with birds and why you have fallen in love with birds and what the pull is of birds. And through that process, I've started noticing more birds around me and have been reflecting a lot on my relationship with birds, which is that I have to confess to you very late in the conversation that I have a somewhat complicated relationship. And I think I had a few kind of traumatic experiences with birds as a kid that turned me off. Like the main one was when I was 7 years old. My family went to the San Diego Zoo and there was like a bird feeding experience for kids. They gave
Mm-hmm.
everyone these little vats of nectar and you were just supposed to stand there and these parrots were going to come and like sweetly take the nectar from you. And I was standing next to my sister and there were all of these birds like coming one at a time to get nectar from her and no one was coming to me. And then an adult just like pushed me into the shade from the sun. And like, I don't know, it felt like a dozen of these parrots came all at once and were like landing on my arms and my shoulders. And I completely freaked out. Like, felt like I was living the
Uh,
movie The Birds. And I just like have had a very visceral reaction for a long time to like birds in flight coming toward me. And like intellectually, I know that they're beautiful, but I feel a sense of fear watching them fly, especially when they're close. And I'm just so curious to pose that to you as someone who is so comfortable being so close to these creatures. Like, is this fear of birds something you've encountered? Is this common?
oh yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
I've encountered it, and
Okay.
you know, there are family members. I have family who have those same fears, and to give you and those folks a little bit of grace, you know, the media hasn't done the greatest job of teaching
Yeah.
us. You know, Alfred Hitchcock
Yeah.
didn't do anyone any
Exactly.
favors, and those lorikeets, those birds
Yes, that's what they
that
were. Lorikeets.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah, that came down to you. I mean, here all of a sudden, these inaccessible creatures, these flighted things that we'll never touch, are all over you,
Yes.
and you begin to feel differently about them because there they are.
Yeah.
And so there's a boundary between human beings and birds,
Hmm.
and that boundary between us is primarily the domination of the skies without any engine except the one beating in your chest. You know, birds have been engineered by evolution to do something that we will never be able to do without engineering in itself. And so to have those creatures so close,
Hmm.
and to have sort of this the mystery and the mystique of birds suddenly in your face, I think for some folks there's sort of this there's this ignition of the limbic, almost as it is with many people and reptiles, especially
Yes.
snakes,
Yes.
that seeing a snake when you're not surprised by it is very different than, I don't know, picking up something and there it is underneath, or that it's in a place where it's not supposed to be. And birds aren't supposed to be close to us.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, they're wild things that live these lives that are mysteries. And so I think there's this algorithm that sort of puts itself together and again ignites the limbic to say, oh my God, these birds are here. Why are they here so close to me? Alfred told me that they would spin themselves into my hair or that they would peck my eyes out, let me scream and run away. And we've largely not been disabused of that.
Yeah.
That oftentimes the fantastical thing that happens when someone maybe has a negative encounter with a bird is magnified versus all of the positive encounters or non-encounters that occur.
I mean, you make such a good point that that is the anomaly is that the bird is so close to me. Like they are not supposed to be that way. We are not supposed to be feeding them probably in that controlled setting of a zoo. But yeah, that is a really helpful reframe of like that one experience was these two creatures being put in such close proximity that they're not actually supposed to be in that proximity.
Yeah, I mean, it's in the larger context, Anita, I think we can expand that to wildness and
Yeah.
wild. And part of the reason there are so many conflicts now between human beings and wild animals as we encroach upon their world And then some of them are adaptable enough to live in the world that we have created by destroying their world. There are boundaries that break down. And as those boundaries break down, and you can look out into your backyard and there's a raccoon or there's a coyote on a sidewalk. I mean, think about it. Those two things just don't seem to go together. Why is that animal here? And it elicits a very different response than seeing that animal out in the wilds where you know it, quote unquote, should be. But all we have to do is sort of turn that on its head and say, well, what is the coyote thinking? The coyote is saying, why are you here? And so those sorts of things that as a scientist, we would advise don't anthropomorphize, don't give human qualities to non-human beings. As a poet and a creative writer, I can do that. And at the very least, have us think not just as human beings, but think of ourselves as biospheric beings who are sharing this earth with wild birds and other wild things. And once we begin to get a little bit of a grip on that, then I think maybe we're less likely to be instantly afraid or to want to persecute animals for being animals.
I'm so curious to ask you about that line between the noticing of wildness and how it actually impacts how we interact with birds, because I feel like there has been such an explosion of bird watchers and people who bird since the pandemic. And there's like this renewed interest and excitement of people paying attention to birds and getting into birding. But has that had any impact on conservation or conversations about conservation? Like, are we changing how we interact with birds because so many more people are watching and noticing them?
That is a great question, something that I that I think about on a daily basis and write about a good bit. I think the easy answer for me is it hasn't helped nearly as much as it should have.
Mm-hmm.
If I had to choose an answer between yes and no, has it helped from a conservation standpoint? I would have to say yes, but marginally, because there are now millions of bird watchers, but billions of birds have disappeared since bird watching became popular, since it was sort of sporterized into birding in the late 60s and early 70s. In those 50 years, we've lost 3 billion birds, but gained millions of birders. And so those two lines on a graph are going in opposite directions. And as people would say, make that make sense. How does that happen? And I think part of where it's happened is that the scale at which we can see birds, that we can watch birds, that we can list birds has been accelerated by technology, by better glass and binoculars, by apps that can tell you with a great degree of certainty what a bird is, even if you're only hearing part of its song. In the midst of all of that, I don't think that we have developed any more empathy for the dual plight of birds and all other beings. So I think there has been an objectification of birds in many ways in modern birding, and that the birds end up on lists, and that some of these lists are very helpful for understanding the ranges of birds, maybe even understanding the population dynamics of certain birds, but it does not seem to be translating to fewer birds disappearing. And if you look at the history of this country, when we've experienced extinction in the last few generations of birds like Carolina parakeets or ivory-billed woodpeckers or passenger pigeons or heath hens or Labrador ducks or dusky seaside sparrows, that technology has had some role in that, that our rates of destruction lead to the despair of birds. And so we have to think about that. We have to think about what kind of earth we want to share. And it can't just be the earth that humans want. It also has to fit what the wild things demand and desire. And so that, again, that conundrum of more birders birding, giving us more data, has not yet, from any data that I have seen, translated into more birds being saved. And so as someone feeds birds in their backyard, and they buy the seed to feed the birds and watch the birds, and maybe some out of range rarity shows up, how do we take bird feeding and watching birds to that next level? I want that to be the question.
So, at this phase of your life, how do you make time for the deep noticing that's required to be present with birds in a way that's beyond just, seeing them to log them in the app? It's actually a way of connecting with them, which I know is important to you. How do you make time for that? What does that look like in this phase of your life?
It it increasingly, it looks like going out without my binoculars.
Uh-huh.
I found that sometimes going out and accepting what I can see with my eyes and my eyeglasses, or the pictures that I can take with my cell phone. This point in my life is about the broader field of view. I love birds more than I ever have, and I want to be able to see them close up. I love seeing the eye of a bird, or watching a sparrow yawn in a sunny spot on a cool day. It just gives me a great deal of joy to see that close up, but it also gives me this joy of wonder when a flock of blackbirds flies over and I'm hearing those metallic calls, knowing that there are grackles there, but maybe I'm hearing something different that might be a brewer's blackbird or a rusty blackbird, or maybe there are starlings mixed in, but I can't quite tell, and I'm okay with that. I'm okay with the wonder of not knowing every single answer. And that's part of the magic of birds. We can never know what birds are really thinking. We can't say in watching hawks pair bonding this time of year and screaming and careening through the air and kind of doing some of these acrobatics, that there isn't a certain amount of joy involved in their flight. Science tells us not to anthropomorphize, though, and so the scientist holds back from thinking about that, certainly holds back from reporting it, I should say. The poet sees it and doesn't necessarily put human qualities on the bird, but gives the bird the freedom to have its own joy in the way that that bird has joy and that humans can't. I know I'm on the extreme end of things, but to see birds as whos rather than whats, if you think about just that transition in itself, it puts non-human beings on equal footing with human beings. If we see these as fellow Earth travelers with superpowers that we can only imagine, seeing in the ultraviolet spectrum, following star charts that they see, but they probably also feel, being able to sleep half your brain, being able to hover midair or fly backwards as a hummingbird does, or being able to sleep on the wing as a swift does, or being able to sing 3 notes at once as many thrushes do. Look and think and feel, and you'll come to a conclusion that birds are not just worthy of love and adoration. For me, they're worthy of a kind of worship. And so I try to take that with me when I go on, whether it's short walks around the farm or whether I'm in some distant place, to try to give the birds a chance to show me who they are rather than me chasing them to tell them who they are.
Drew, thank you so much for the conversation, for all of the wisdom and stories that you have shared today. It's been a pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you so much, Anita, for the time and for sharing your bird stories too.
You can find out more about Drew Lanham and his work at our website, embodywunc.org. Today's episode was produced by Kaya Finlay and edited by Amanda Magnus. Sarah Nix provided additional editorial guidance. Adesina Newkirk is our intern, and Jenny Lawson, our technical director. Quilla wrote our theme music. This program is recorded at the American Tobacco Historic District. WUNC is a broadcast service of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I'm Anita Rao.